The subject today is the flood and the account of Noah's family after the flood, and then the Tower of Babel. So we're looking at everything from Genesis 6 through 11. If you are, I don't know how Chap talks about or breaks up the historical periods for the Old Testament. For my classes, I talk about 9 major historical periods covered in the Old Testament, and this ends the first major historical period, the primeval period, the first things that happen. And one of the things that we'll see through this section is a kind of continuation of a theme that has already started. And before I get into the events of this section and that theme and how it keeps getting reinforced, I want to ask y'all some questions, and y'all don't be the quiet class for this part. Answer some questions, all right? I'll ask you some questions about what y'all have already studied, covered, and what Chap has taught. So that I can kind of dovetail into that better. Dealing with the probably immediate previous lecture, you probably talked about the fall, right? What is the fall? What happened?
He eats the fruit of the forbidden tree.
There you go. And Adam is like right there when it happens. I mean, he was there during the whole conversation, the whole thing, and he totally abdicated his responsibility to speak up. And so, Adam and Eve do the one thing that they were commanded not to do. And what are the consequences? What is the result of the fall?
Sin enters the world.
All right. Sin enters the world. They commit the first sin, and that does something that changes human nature so that we are more prone to sin, to failure, and to corrupting our own intentions or corrupting our own best efforts. And so things go wrong. We tend to do the selfish thing or the self-protecting thing rather than the best thing, and that leads to tons of different forms of corruption and pain and misery in the world. So that was one of the major consequences of the fall, and it is the one that actually I was most anxious to get to make sure that y'all understood and knew about, because we're going to be dealing with some of that. But what are the other consequences? What else happened? They got the boot. They couldn't stay in the garden anymore. They got the boot, got kicked out, and they die. Without access to the tree of life, or as a result of their sin, they live out their mortal life and they die instead of having potentially long or even unending life. And so, removed from the garden, they die over time, and their natures are changed so that they tend to do what they ought not. They tend to be self-protecting, self-serving, rather than doing what's right. And that all of those consequences and that nature gets passed down from them to their children, and because they are the parents of all, the whole human race is affected by sin, by this sin nature. And so a lot of what we're going to see in today's text is that corruption, that sinful nature, and the consequences of it playing out. And if you look, I don't know what Chap did with this in chapter 4, but if you look at, the fall happens in chapter 3, and you look at chapter 4, there's immediately the consequences. That sinful nature, that corrupted nature starts to work its way out, and that Adam and Eve have 2 sons, Cain and Abel, and Cain kills his brother Abel in jealousy because Abel's offering is accepted by God and Cain's is not. And so Cain kills his brother Abel in jealousy, and then God punishes Cain by telling him that not only is the ground cursed because of him and it won't produce good fruit all the time, but for Cain specifically, it'll produce nothing. And so he can't live by farming, and so he's going to be this wanderer all over the earth, and he'll have to live off of other people's produce. And so Cain actually builds the first cities because he's got to have a way to survive off of other people's produce, and so he gathers people together, builds cities, and that's how he lives. Well, Cain is also very worried that because he's known as a murderer, he's going to be killed by somebody else. Somebody else is going to take vengeance on him for what he did to his brother and kill him. And so he is worried and complains to God about this. And so God gives him a mark, the mark of Cain, puts this mark on his forehead and promises that anyone that harms Cain, he will be avenged 7 times. And so if anybody harms Cain, they'll get paid back 7 times over. They'll get it 7 times as bad. And if they kill Cain, it'll be even worse, 7 times over. Well, go down several generations, and Cain has a great-great-grandson named Lamech. And Lamech is famous now for, it's recorded that he was the first to marry 2 women, to have 2 wives. And then one day he starts bragging to his 2 wives that he has done something sees himself as being even greater than his great-great-grandfather Cain, because he has killed a man for injuring him. He murdered somebody for insulting him. And he says, if Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech 77 times. And so he's proud that he is greater than Cain, because he is avenged 77 times. And if you notice, the big difference there is God promised Cain to protect him and avenge him 7 times to protect him. Lamech takes it on himself to avenge himself 77 times and murders a man for insulting him. And so there's this progression of corruption. Cain murders his brother, and Lamech later is proud of being even greater than Cain and murdering this man for insulting him. And that progression of corruption, the consequences of sin and people doing the wrong thing or tending to do the wrong thing, keeps working its way out. Until now, we're in Genesis chapter 6. Several generations have passed. Adam and Eve have another son named Seth, and then we're given the family line of Seth. And several generations later, Noah is born, and Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and we'll get to them in a minute. And God looks at the earth and looks at what's going on the earth, and he sees corruption and violence and evil being done everywhere. And the statement is, the very extreme statement of the corruption is in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. It says, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. That's a really extreme statement of how bad things had gotten. And it's probably hyperbolic. In fact, we know that at least one man was still relatively righteous and tried to walk with God, and God ends up preserving this man, Noah, and his family through what's coming. But this extreme statement, that all the thoughts, every thought of the human heart, the inclination and thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time, it's bad. It has gotten very bad. And so God determines to wipe out the population of the earth, to wipe out human beings, and to start over basically with just Noah and his family. And not only is Noah and his family going to be affected by that, but if you remember, the first command in Genesis was that Adam and his wife were to rule over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, the livestock on the land. They were to rule over all the animals. And so their corruption and the consequences of their actions affect all of the rest of creation. And so as God is dealing with humanity, all of the rest of the creatures on earth are going to be affected by it. And so God tells Noah, looks at Noah, who is relatively righteous, who's following God and is relatively blameless among the people of the earth at the time. God tells Noah what his plan is, that he's going to wipe out humanity and start over with Noah and his family. And so the words, or the expression of it a little lower down in chapter 6, verse 11, starting, it's, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. And God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm going to destroy them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. So God starts to give him instructions for building the ark. And so things have gone really dark, really bad. Humanity has gotten really ugly and violent, harmful to each other pretty much constantly. And so God determines to wipe them out by a flood. And at this point, the texts are going to say that it's not raining regularly. This is not a thing that is happening. Rain isn't falling. Instead, water is coming up from the earth in the form of mist. There's something under the ground that's evaporating, and that's producing this mist that actually waters all the plants on the surface. And so people aren't real familiar with rain at this point. It's not something that's happening often. And so there's no rain is falling, and there's this mist that comes up. But God looks at Noah and tells him, you need to build a big boat, because rain is going to fall, there's going to be this massive flood, and I'm going to wipe out all the people through this flood. And so Noah, despite having no experience with rain and flooding, Noah trusts God and starts to build the ark. And God gives instructions for building the ark and tells him to make it out of a particular kind of wood. And if you look in your NIV, it says cypress wood, and then there's this little footnote icon, or this little letter next to it, telling you to look down in the footnotes. And the footnotes will tell you we really don't know what this word means. We don't know what kind of wood it was. If you're more familiar with the old translations, King James translation, for example, King James version says gopher wood, but we don't know what that is either. I mean, I could not possibly tell you what gopher wood looks like. I have a big old stack of cypress in my carport because I'm an amateur woodworker and I like making things, but we don't know that cypress was actually what was intended with that word. It was made of something, but we don't know what. Some kind of wood. And given dimensions for it. It says that that he was to make the ark 300 cubits long. And a cubit, if you're not super familiar with ancient, measurements, if you don't measure things in cubits normally, a cubit was supposed to be from the fingertips. Take a man's arm, and it's supposed to be from his fingertips to the inside of his elbow. And so that was supposed to be about a cubit, and that works out roughly to be about 18 inches long, or a foot and a half. And so a 300 cubit long ark or boat was going to be about 450 feet, which means that if you go out to, Wildcat Stadium, you look at the football field, and you can imagine the football field being about, half as long more than it is. Take like 50-yard line and then add that on to the end. 150 yards long is about how long the ark was. It's a big old boat, right? And so Noah builds this big old boat. It's also supposed to be 50 cubits wide. It's about 75 feet. So it's a big boat. And Noah and probably from time to time his 3 sons are the ones building it. And Noah has to plant crops and do all the farming in and around all this. And so it ends up taking Noah about a century to build it. So he spends about 100 years building this boat. And then finally the boat is finished. The ark is finished. And God causes these animals to start coming by. And Noah tells Noah to start bringing in these animals into the ark, to bring in a pair of every kind of animal from the earth, to make sure that their lines aren't destroyed. So God is going to preserve the various species, the various animals of the earth through these pairs that are coming into the ark. And then there's an extra little detail that God tells Noah to bring in 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal. And so it wasn't just 2 of every kind of animal. There were also supposed to be for every clean animal, which is the animals that human beings can eat after they're given the command in a little bit. We'll get there in a second. And after that humans can sacrifice it, that can be sacrificed to God as an offering. Those animals, they're to take 7 pairs instead of 1 pair. And part of the reason for that is so that there'll be enough for them to eat later, to start flocks and have livestock, and then also so that they'll have something to offer as sacrifice. And so all these animals start coming by. Noah puts them in the ark, and he starts to stack away their provisions to make sure they have enough food, and everything gets laid in and prepared and ready. And then there's this extra 7 days of the ark just kind of being open. And at the end of that 7 days, God closes up the ark and the rain starts coming. And the text says that the rains came for 40 days and 40 nights. It rained straight for 40 days and 40 nights. And then there's also these springs of the earth that break open, and so there's some kind of subterranean water source that is brought out, is pushed up to the surface. And so these underground rivers or springs, something happens tectonically, they get pushed up. And so this water comes up, flooding out from the earth, and then it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. And the text describes it as the tops of the highest mountains were covered over by about 15 cubits, which is about another 22 feet, just deep enough that you ain't swimming in, right? I was also a lifeguard at one point, and 22 feet is plenty for somebody to drown. No matter how good a swimmer you are, if you can't get anywhere that's not at least 22 feet underwater, you're going to drown eventually. And this water comes up after 40 days and 40 nights of rain. It gets to that height, and that flood water stays for 150 days, more than long enough for everything on the land, every animal and bird to die. And so after the end of that period of 150 days of the floodwater remaining, the floodwater starts to go down, and Noah starts to send out birds as a kind of a test to see if it's safe to open the doors of the ark and to come out yet. And so first he sends out a raven, and the raven searches and comes back and lands back in, and it flew around for a while and it came back. And so obviously it had nowhere to land. And so Noah waits about a week, and then he sends out a dove. And again, comes back, lands, nothing, wait a week, sends dove out again, and this time the dove comes back with an olive leaf in its beak, which means that the trees have at least, the tops of the trees have been exposed. There's at least some vegetation exposed to the air now. And so waits another week and sends dove out again, and this time the dove doesn't come back, which means the dove has found somewhere that it can land and nest, and it doesn't need to come back to the ark for somewhere to live. And so waits a little while longer, and then finally Noah and his family open up the ark, all the animals are released. This whole flood story has run its course. But after they come out of the ark, Noah and his family take some of the animals that are of the clean variety, and they make an offering to God in gratitude for saving them. And then God makes a covenant with Noah and his family. And in fact, not just with Noah and his family, but with all of humanity, with all of the human race. And the covenant that God makes, the word covenant may be kind of unfamiliar if you're not, outside of religious context, outside of church. We don't really talk about covenant in any form, culturally speaking. So it's not a word that is super familiar to us. You can think of covenant as being a very strong form or a more intense form of a contract. We think of a contract as being, two parties agreeing together to do something in writing. They form a contract, and each side says, the contract specifies what each side's part in that relationship is going to be. I'll provide this and this and this for so much money, for example. And so you've got each side saying exactly what their part in the relationship and their role in the relationship is going to be, and they agree to it, they sign it, and it's legally binding on them. That's a contract. A covenant was similar in that you had both sides specifying what their role in the relationship was going to be, but it wasn't signed and notarized by any kind of official government entity. It was agreed on between two people before the powers in the universe. So the gods that they worshipped, or for Israelites, God. And so it was acknowledged before God, or before the gods, with the understanding that if you break this covenant, the gods are going to be angry and there's going to be consequences. And sometimes that consequence is very well specified as being death. If either side breaks the covenant, it's death. And so the covenant think of it as a very strong contract. And God makes a covenant with humanity to never again destroy the people of the earth by flood, to never again use flood to kill off the human race and start over. And the sign of this covenant, when God makes a covenant with people, there's always a sign attached. And so the sign of this covenant is the rainbow. And you hear that, God gave the rainbow as a sign of his covenant, never again to destroy the earth by flood. And that sounds good, but there's an image or a piece that gets missed. The description is that God puts his bow in the clouds, and that's the rainbow. And we think of it, we think of a bow as being this kind of, archery, right? It's a bow is a thing that you do sports with. Archery is a sports competition now. You can go to the Olympics for it. You may even get a scholarship for it. I don't know if Bethel has archery. Does Bethel have archery? I can't keep up with all the sports that Bethel has now. But you have you can get a scholarship for sports, for archery. If you are a hunter, you can hunt with a bow. There's a bow season for hunting deer in Tennessee, probably elsewhere as well. Lots of places have it. So you can go hunting for it, but very few people are hunting for their living or hunting for their daily bread. People do that as a sport and will eat the meat as kind of a side thing, but most people aren't really depending on hunting game to survive. And so we don't really think of the bow as being anything but a sport item. But in the days that Moses was alive, and Moses is writing down the contents of Genesis, and during that period, the bow was actually a really fierce weapon of war. If you had a good cadre of archers shooting bows at an enemy, and they didn't have good archers to answer with, it wasn't much of a fight. I mean, a good group of archers could really change the course of a war. And so archery, the bow was a very fearsome weapon of war, a very powerful weapon of war. And so the image that we see in Genesis is God taking his bow and hanging it in the clouds. And when someone would hang their bow, it was a sign of peace, that it was a promise not to fight, not to use the bow. So for an archer to take their bow and hang it up is a sign of an intent to maintain peace. And so when God takes his bow, the rainbow, the image of God hangs his bow in the clouds, God is putting up that weapon of war and promising never to use it again in that way against humanity. And so the promise there is that God will never use flooding to wipe out humanity again, and hangs up his bow as a sign of that covenant. And so now every time that we look up and we see a rainbow, the intention is that we'll remember that covenant, and the covenant will be renewed. You also note that this covenant, we talked about what a covenant is, and that it's, usually it's two sides that are making an agreement. They both state what their agreement is, and they acknowledge it before God or the gods, depending on the culture and what they believe. But you'll notice that this covenant doesn't really have a second side. God makes a promise, God makes a covenant, but there's not really anything for Noah and his family to do on the other end of it. There's nothing that they can fail to do to break the covenant. God just makes a promise and gives the sign of the covenant by hanging a rainbow in the clouds. And so it's not a promise that can be broken. It's not something that's ever going to have an excuse to go back on. There's nothing that humanity could do to break that covenant and free God from the promise. So that's, God makes the covenant with them, and then Noah and his sons and their wives, who are all in the ark, Noah and his wife, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives, all in the ark, they come out and they begin making a civilization again, making humanity again. And Shem, Ham, and Japheth start having children. But before we get very far along here, we get out of the flood account and into Noah and his family, something weird happens. I mean, it's just a weird scene, a weird moment. It's not really flattering to humanity that one of the first things that Noah does after being freed from the ark is to plant a vineyard and then take the fruit of the vineyard and make wine, and then when he has the wine, get drunk and pass out naked in his tent. Like that's the story. You look at the latter part of Genesis chapter 9, and that's what happens. That's the story. Noah, being a farmer from before, being a man of the earth from before the flood, plants a vineyard, and then he takes the fruit of the vine, makes wine, and gets drunk and passes out in his tent, apparently uncovered. And then there's this weird follow-up scene. This is what he does. And then he's got these three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and we always say them in this order, but Ham is actually the youngest. And I don't know why we say him in this order, but Ham is the youngest, and Ham comes in to the tent and uncovers his father's nakedness. And we'll come back to that phrase and what it means in a second. But he comes in, and there's his father passed out, drunk, naked. And the description is he uncovered his father's nakedness, and then he goes back out and tells his older brothers what happened, and then his brothers come in with a cloth or a blanket, something draped over their arm, and they walk in backwards so that they don't look at their father's nakedness, and they kind of pitch the blanket over him and cover him, and then come out. And then Dad wakes up later, Noah wakes up later, finds out what happened or discovers what happened, and he pronounces a curse. He curses his son Ham, and specifically his youngest son Canaan, and pronounces this curse over them, and then blesses Shem and Japheth as just following this scene, this moment where Ham uncovers the nakedness of his father. Now, this seems like a kind of extreme reaction, right? I mean, nobody wants to be walked in on naked. I mean, you're in your bedroom, you're changing clothes, somebody you did not know was in the building comes walking in and sees you without any clothes on. That's uncomfortable. You might get mad about it. It's going to be a little embarrassing. Hopefully they apologize, and hopefully it was a genuine accident. But it's something you get over. It's a thing that has probably happened to you at some point in your life, and may happen to you again. It's just a thing that happens. Why does Noah have such an intense reaction and pronounce this curse on his son and his grandson? Because Ham walks in on him naked in the tent. Well, there's a couple possibilities. One is, if you remember back to Genesis chapter 2, the very last words of Genesis 2, when we get that scene of God zooming in on, or the creation of humankind, and Adam and Eve are together, and it's the basis of the marriage covenant in the Old and New Testaments. And the very last line of Genesis chapter 2 is, Adam and his wife were naked, and they felt no shame. And so they're there together, they're naked, and they feel absolutely no shame with one another, even though they're fully exposed. And then in Genesis chapter 3, They are deceived by the serpent, they eat the fruit, and almost immediately the first thing that happens is their eyes are opened and they realize that they're naked. And so they go and they sew fig leaves together to cover up their nakedness. So that they make themselves a covering. And then God gives them an even better covering at the end of the story, end of the chapter, makes coverings or clothing out of skin, animal skins for them, and they cover up with that. And so there's this really immediate connection between their sin, between defying God, disobeying God, and a shame at their own nakedness, shame at being uncovered. And so it's possible that we're just a few chapters past that scene, past chapter 3. We're in chapter 9 now. So we're about 6 chapters past chapter 3, and so maybe it's because there's this very deep connection between nakedness and the consequences of sin and shame. And so to uncover someone's nakedness has a much bigger, more powerful cultural impact. There's something much bigger to them about being found naked because of what happened earlier. Or there's another possibility. The phrase uncovered his nakedness, there's some kind of wonkiness in the Hebrew translating that into English, and it's possible that there's a euphemism in there for something sexual. And so what this could be saying when it says that Ham came in and uncovered his father's nakedness, it could be saying that he went in and molested him, that he did something sexual towards his own father while he was laying there passed out. And if that's the case, you could probably understand why Noah would be really angry when he woke up and have issues with his son. But I mean, we don't really know for sure which way that goes. Again, the translation is kind of ambiguous. It could be a euphemism for doing something untoward, something sexual towards his father, and that would be really weird, and we'd understand that anger. Or it could also be because of the close connection between shame, nakedness, and the shame of the fall, the shame of sin, that to see someone naked is a much bigger cultural taboo at that point, and that's the source of the anger. Or it could just be that Noah is a fallen human being and he was drunk and partly hungover, and he just really reacted poorly to the situation. Any of those are possible. But Noah responds very poorly, responds with a lot of anger towards Ham, and curses his son Canaan by name. And that name, if it's not familiar to you yet from looking at the Old Testament church, it will be familiar to you by the end of this semester, because you're going to run into the people of Canaan, the Canaanites, really often. In fact, by the time that we get just a few chapters further on in Genesis, the people of Canaan, that area, the descendants of this child, this young man, Canaan, they are going to be the people groups that are concerned that Abraham is going to be dealing with mostly, that he's going to be interacting with. And then a chapter further on, or a book further on, we get to Moses' life, and then coming into the promised land that they're to take. The promised land that God gives to the descendants of Abraham, to Jacob and his children, is the land of Canaan, the land that these people, this family group, has largely dwelled in, that they've settled. And most of the trouble that they're going to have with coming into the promised land and then remaining in the promised land through Judges and then beyond, King's stories, is going to be the descendants of Canaan that they struggle with. And so this family group becomes all kinds of trouble for the people of Israel later on. And we also there's another kind of a name, a thing to figure out here. We got Shem. Shem and Japheth, they're blessed. Noah says good things about them. But the name Shem, if you look, the Hebrew alphabet doesn't actually have separate letters for S and for SH. We don't either. We have S and then we tack an H onto it to change the sound, and that's how we get SH. But in Hebrew, you have this one letter, this one character. It's called Shin or Sin. And the difference between Shin and Sin is whether you put a dot above the right side or a dot above the left side. And that can be changed by different things that you do, and it's a little confusing, but this one character is the S sound and the SH sound, depending on its use. And so Shem becomes the father of the Semites, and so all of the descendants of Shem are called the Semites. And if you've ever heard the term anti-Semitism, this is where it comes from, because Abraham's family is descended from Shem, and so all of the Israelites, all Jewish people, are descended from Shem. And so hatred or prejudice towards the Jewish people or towards somebody because they are Jewish is called anti-Semitism because of this name connection. It goes back to Shem, or the Semites, or the descendants of Shem. And so that's anti-Semitism comes from this guy's name. That's, if you've ever wondered why in the world do we call hatred of Jewish people or hatred of Judaism anti-Semitism, there it is. That's why. And so that's the very strange account of Noah's family. Any questions before we roll on to the last chunk? All right. Well, as I said, Abraham's family line is traced in chapter 11 from Shem, and it's several generations past Shem before Abraham comes on the scene. But that's the family line that it comes from. And then there's this other scene it's called the Tower of Babel usually. There is a scene where there are these people, this large group of people start gathering together and start pulling people together, and they build this city in the plains of Shinar. And in the plains of Shinar, they build this city and they make this plan, and they start baking bricks, which was new technology. They start baking bricks, and they're going to glue the bricks together with tar or pitch as kind of mortar between them. And they want to build this enormous tower that reaches to the heavens. And the reason that they want to do this is to make a name for themselves, and so that they won't be scattered across the face of the earth. And so they're doing this, they make this plan, they've built this city, and they want to build this enormous tower in the city, all as high as they can get it, up to the heavens is the description. And they want to do it in order to make a name for themselves and so that they won't be scattered. And so the idea seems to be that they want to do this so that they don't get picked apart or scattered out, so that they'll be better able to live and survive and thrive and cooperate, work together towards the goals that they want to. And God looks at that situation and says, that's a terrible idea. They can't do that. In fact, the phrase used is, there will be no end to the evil that they could do. And so he says, if they're allowed to remain together, there'll be no end to the evil that they could do. And so God causes their languages to divide. The people stop being able to fully understand each other. And of course, once they stop being able to understand each other, building this enormous tower, this huge construction project becomes impossible. And so they start grouping together around who can understand who, and then they scatter out from there. And that forms all of the different languages and people groups that we have to this day. That's the origin for all of the different languages and people groups, is this scattering from Babel. And when we hear that, we hear the summary would be people from all over, huge group of humans were gathered together for the purpose of working together and cooperating to create this huge project so that they wouldn't be scattered and that they would be able to stay together and continue cooperating from then on. And God says, That strikes a lot of people as being, cruel and backwards. Why would God object to people cooperating and working together, generally peaceably? Why would that be a problem? And so that's the question. And I have an answer that I'll give you in a minute, but I want to hear your best guess. Why do you think God would look at this situation and say that's a bad idea? No guess. Somebody's got to have something, a guess of some kind.
They might go against him, his word, maybe.
Might go against what he wanted, what his command.
Formulating his opinions or whatever like that.
Okay. I think there's something to that. That's part of it. Any other guesses? Well, one of the most common explanations, one of the explanations given a lot in churches especially, is that they were trying to build this tower to heaven, and so that their goal was to climb up and to be able to get to where God or the gods are and take their place among the gods, or even to replace the gods. And so it was pride and hubris that was their big sin, the big problem there. And God scatters their language to keep them from being able to do that. That's possible, but I don't think that's the explanation. I think God gave the explanation actually in the words that I've said. There's no end to the evil that they'll be able to do. we look at the different nations, different people groups, and we see historically the wars and the conflicts between them and how that misunderstanding has caused a lot of death and pain and misery. And so the scattering of people, dividing of people, forcing them to shatter into different people groups has created a situation where there's been a ton of conflict, lots of war, lots of fighting, and lots of misery because of not being able to fully understand each other. And we see that, and so we look at that and say, well, I mean, why would God cause that? Why would God do that? But I want you to think about for a second, what would the alternative be like? Let's say that God had not scattered the languages, people were allowed to remain all together and to cooperate and do whatever they set their mind to, and so whatever they could work together towards whatever goal that they wanted, and they would be able to cooperate and do that. They'd be able to all work together towards the same goal. What if their goal was evil? What if the thing that they'd settled on doing, the thing that they decided to do, was harmful? What if they decided that all of this group decided that all people with blue eyes should be wiped out? That blue eyes was evil and you shouldn't have that, and if you have blue eyes, then you're dead. Yeah, I'm gone, right? Would that be good? Would cooperation towards an evil end be good? Imagine, if that's a little too abstract or hard to imagine, everybody uses Hitler as an example, right? So let's use Hitler for an example. Imagine, I mean, the actual way that Hitler's reign went was he came to power, he did a whole lot of terrible stuff, but there were a lot of other people groups around and they banded together and defeated him, defeated what he intended, defeated what Nazi Germany intended, and ended that. Imagine what would happen if there were no other people groups. It was all one people, and someone like Hitler came to power, and there was no other nation, no other people group on earth to oppose him. What would the world have been like? Or you go further back, and if you probably aren't, I mean, nobody is super familiar with Roman history anymore, so it's not like a thing that most people know, but if Hannibal and the Carthaginians were a major power that was opposed to the Romans, and the Carthaginians had worshipped Moloch, and one of their worship ceremonies was to take infants and throw them into a fire in the middle of the city. And it was part of the sacrifices to Moloch. What if something like that power had been able to go on unchecked and there were no other people groups to oppose them in all the world? That's what there was. Would that have turned out well for humanity? For anybody? So if the ability of human beings to cooperate together makes them extremely versatile, makes us extremely capable of doing a whole lot of different things, and when our intentions are good and our actions are good, it's fantastic, it's amazing. But our ability to cooperate and to do incredibly big things is a terror when the things that we want to do are wrong and evil. And God looks at human beings and the potential that they have to do evil, the potential that they have to do things, and says, if there's no opposition, if that ability is unchecked, there's no end to the evil they'll be able to do. And God scatters the languages so that there's always divided people groups, and most likely people aren't all going to go wrong all at the same time and all the same way. And so when there's a Hitler, there's usually also a United States, Britain, and so on, all the various other allied powers to oppose him. And when there is a Hannibal and a Carthage, there's also a Rome to oppose them. And when there is, pick your evil, eventually that there is a people to oppose them, and it can only go so far before it gets struck down. And it does cause and lead to a whole bunch of other forms of pain and misery, but it prevents some others. And my claim for Babel and for other situations in Scripture is that God is wise enough to know which one was the lesser of the two evils. And if God scattered the languages because that was going to be the lesser of the two evils, to have people opposing each other so that evil couldn't go unchecked, that was probably the best thing. That's my explanation for why Babel. But God causes the languages to be scattered there, and the people group together and start wandering off to form different nations, different people groups, different cultures. And that place, the tower that they were trying to build, ends up being called Babel because of the scattering of the languages. And that Babel ends up being some of the people scattered from there end up being the progenitors of the Babylonians, the people of Babel, the Babylonian Empire. And you're going to run into the Babylonian Empire towards the end of the semester as you get into the divided kingdom period and then the fall of the southern kingdom, Judah, and being carried off into captivity. It's the Babylonians that carry Judah off into captivity. Any questions? All right. Well, the last couple things, the family line of Shem, we're talking about that. The Babel scene happens, but then we're given the account of the family line of Shem down to Abram, who will become Abraham. And we see that Abram's father is named Terah, and he has 3 sons. And somewhere along the way, one of those sons is killed. He dies. And Terah takes his family and moves them, and they end up settling in a region called Haran. They wanted to go to the land of Canaan, to where the Canaanites lived, but they settled somewhere along the way and settled in this region Haran. And then from there, from that place, God calls Abram and speaks to him and makes a promise to him that leads Abram to get up and leave his family, and begins the whole story that you're going to be picking up on Monday, and the rest of the Old Testament flows from Abram's willingness to get up and follow God when he calls. All right. If there's no other questions, that's it. Make sure if you did not on the way in that you hit the sign-up sheet in the hallway on the way out. It's on the table between the doors, and Chaplain will be back with you on Monday.